Welcome to 99 zu 1. I always say that in German because, yeah, 99 to 1 sounds not as cool. Today we have a special guest here with us, Milton Alimadi. I'll bring him in the room immediately. Hello, Milton. Welcome to 99 zu 1.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me.
Good to have you again. We left off in, I think, beginning of January. We were talking about, and look, I got a hard copy now. That
Viva.
It's manufacturing hate.
When I visit Germany, I'm going to sign that for you.
Oh yes, please, definitely. And if you are in Berlin, for sure, please say hello. At least I'll meet you somewhere. We talked in the beginning, actually, before this episode, we talked about how I had quite a few questions, and maybe we make a couple of episodes out of this. So we ended the last episode at the end of part 1 of your book. I think we talked about your own experience with media, especially also academic media, and publishing when it comes to talking about the depiction of Africans in Western media.
Right.
We also then went into the weeds and talked a little bit about the so-called explorers of Europe and how they were reporting on what they saw on their exploring missions. Talked about, I think we ended with the story of Samuel Baker meeting Komoro of the Lokuto, and how he was flabbergasted at the materialism and the materialist arguments that this person brought, and he actually sounded like
like a superstitious witch doctor.
Exactly, that's it, right. And where we then ended up is part 2, which is we didn't really start there, and this is also where I want to start right now.
Sure.
So in part 2 of your book, you start by discussing that there's a pretty stubborn stereotype around, of course, already since, probably since hundreds of years, which is the idea that the people of Africa were not even capable of resistance when the colonialists came, when slavers came in order to capture Africans and enslave them in the US, that there was no resistance, there was no fight against that, and that this stereotype that they were easily defeated, they were docile, they were weak. That is already something that kind of has been, like, for example, what Walter Rodney talks about, how this is historically absolute nonsense. Absolutely. And basically propaganda. You show in your book, which is interesting, how actually the media in that time, but all actually until today, helped uphold this image in the coverage of, for example, how the British invaded, how the Italians invaded Ethiopia, for example.
Correct.
Can you give us an overview, or maybe some examples of how media helped in upholding this narrative of the weak and defenseless African, and how this is not true at all?
Right. Okay. Because that is an important component of the narrative. In order to, as we discussed in the first episode, demonization is not only to affect the people who are the victims of aggression and conquest, to make them feel inferior and give up resistance. But demonization is also to condition the metropolis, right? The home body, for the population to accept the domination of other people and convince them that these are indeed inferior to us. So now you cannot have a situation where the so-called inferiors are defeating European soldiers set out on conquest, because that would completely defeat your own logic and argument for colonial conquest, or whether it was conquest during enslavement. And for people that are not familiar, I'm glad you brought up Rodney. He discusses a lot of those wars of resistance against the slavers in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And for people that don't have the time to read, I know we live in a very busy world now. You can listen to part of the audio if you go to YouTube and search for How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So we are talking about the more recent era during the era of colonial conquest now. This is after now slavery is now a obstacle for the expansion of global capital. So now we have a new narrative. Now we are going to civilize the natives in Africa. And that is why we have to conquer them. And in the course of conquering, if we kill a couple of million, like 10 million in the Congo, that is just a part of the, the civilizing mission, right?
Right.
So now when you have the narrative disrupted by African resistance and African victories, that needs to be distorted, or it needs to be wiped out of the history books. And that essentially is what has happened. So for example, if we look at the victory of the Zulu over the British Army in 1879 in South Africa, a great battle on January 22, when the Zulu commander, General Khoza, defeated the British Army, killed 1,600 soldiers, and sent the rest of them fleeing. That story was not told. That story was only told much later. The story that was told was when the British came back, reinforced with a bigger army, and they had another battle on July 25th, the same year, 1879. That was the story of the British victory. The story of the Zulu victory, the other victory, that could not be told for obvious reasons. It would disrupt the narrative and the stereotype of the docile, accepting, inferior African. And it was very interesting how the New York Times covered that as well. The New York Times did a story on focusing on the second clash where the British prevailed. And I'm paraphrasing from the article that I critique in my book, where the British, the victory of a superior civilized army was inevitable, despite any type of resistance from a savage army. I'm paraphrasing, but those were the words used. Now, look at the irony here. Here are African people defending their sovereignty, because the Zulu had a very highly advanced society. So essentially, they're defending their sovereignty, they're defending their property, their herds, and their land. And the New York Times, of course, which is not surprising, because the New York Times, as I also critique, had many editorials promoting colonization. So it's not surprising that they would celebrate the British victory and totally ignore the Zulu victory. And then, of course, another second major one, which was also important for the British, was General Gordon, AKA Chinese Gordon. General Gordon, this highly celebrated British imperial officer, and his defeat in the Sudan in 1885. And it was so interesting because initially, all the newspapers were insisting, the British newspapers, that Gordon should go to the Sudan and crush the Mahdi, Muhammad Mahdi, who had emerged as accepted by the Sudanese as the prophet, the Mahdi. And he was expanding his domain and pushing back the British and Egyptian imperial armies, because at that time, the Sudan was ruled by both the Egyptians and by the British. Of course, Egypt was a dependency of both the British and the French at that time. So all the newspapers said only Gordon can push back the Mahdi. They wrote several editorials until the British government, which was initially reluctant, agreed, and they sent General Gordon to the Sudan. And then, lo and behold, within a very short time, he was surrounded by the Mahdi's army. And the Mahdi sent him many letters imploring him to surrender and to convert to Islam, and said that was the only way that I will spare your life. Said, if you try to surrender after we break down your defenses, that will not be acceptable. but if you surrender in advance of the major battle and convert to Islam. And of course, that was completely unacceptable, not only to Gordon, but for the European media back in Britain. So ultimately, the Mahdi did attack, and General Gordon was killed. Now, the coverage of that is so interesting. Even though he was killed in battle, the headlines referred to the Mahdi's army as a treacherous, quote unquote, treacherous army, and that they killed Gordon in a very treacherous manner, when in fact Gordon had been sent out to kill the Mahdi himself. And in fact, the Mahdi had given instructions that Gordon should not be killed. He should be captured alive and brought to him. Perhaps he wanted to give him one more chance to actually convert. But his soldiers ended up killing him and actually beheading him and taking the head back to the Mahdi. Now, 13 years later, the Mahdi was long dead. 13 years later, the British sent another army under Lord Kitchener, and this time they defeated the Mahdi's successor, who was the Khalifa. And after he was killed, they actually excavated the Mahdi's body and threw the remains into the River Nile and sent the skull to Evelyn Baring, who was a senior colonial officer. Although I understand he declined to accept the skull. I don't know what ever happened to that skull. And then the final example, of course, is actually the greatest one in terms of anti-colonial resistance in Africa, which was caused, of course, the Battle of Adwa, when the Ethiopians defeated an invading Italian imperial army, the army of King Umberto, and the commander-in-chief, General Oreste Baratieri, had promised to return with Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia in a cage so that he could be displayed in the zoos in Rome. But not only did he not get a chance to return with the emperor in a cage, the Italian army was annihilated. An army of about 17,000 that included several thousands of Italian soldiers and officers and 5 Italian generals and many soldiers from neighboring Eritrea. Eritrea had already been conquered and was an Italian colony by that time. And General Oreste Baratieri himself ended up running from the battle scene. The Ethiopians killed 2 other generals, captured 1 general, captured more than 3,000 Italian soldiers, and killed about 3,000 as well. And this story is not widely told for obvious reasons, because this would be a complete repudiation of the colonial agenda. And people back in Europe would have started asking questions. How could it be that a major European force can be defeated by an African army? In fact, what they did is they took the captives back to Addis Ababa and put them to work. So now you have the tables literally turned, where you have Africans now practically enslaving their would-be European conquerors and putting them to work, building the capital city, Addis Ababa. And they did not release them till the following year, after Italy was made to pay several millions in compensation before they released them. And after that defeat in 1896, March 1, 1896, it completely destabilized the Italian government, and there were riots on the streets in Rome and other cities in Italy, and the Italian government actually collapsed as a result of a military defeat in an African country. And you can imagine all the fears that might have come to their mind, because now that they might possibly be thinking, now that our army has been defeated, they don't even probably know where it is, right? The general population. Is it possible that this African army that defeated us in Africa might actually pursue us, pursue our soldiers, and come all the way to invade Italy? That thought must have crossed the minds of many people in Italy. So these are the major examples of the disruption of the colonial narrative in Africa.
And on the other hand, I mean, on the one hand, they are downplaying or, yeah, I mean, everything short of completely erasing of history, or even in their
Yes.
reporting that there is any kind of resistance. On the other hand, they are basically downplaying the same way their own crimes and atrocities, right? So this is also
Absolutely.
another thing that you show in this chapter, where you talk about, in particular, as in response then to Adwa and the
Yes,
second
right.
invasion of Ethiopia,
Right.
Mussolini's crimes, and how these were basically, yeah, let's say whitewashed maybe, or
Absolutely.
twisted. Yeah, can you
Yes.
elaborate a bit on this?
Yes, of course. Benito, fascist Mussolini, uh, wanted to get the revenge, because that defeat in Africa, of course, that disturbed the Italians generally. The story could not be ignored, not in Italy at least, because all these body bags had to be sent home, the remains of the soldiers that had died, and the newspapers covered that widely. So that humiliation never went away. So when Mussolini was finally in power, he invaded uh, Ethiopia, which was then under Emperor Selassie. And Ethiopia was a member of the League of Nations before the United Nations had been founded. And he made an appeal for the League to intervene and to protect the sovereignty of Ethiopia. But obviously, he found out the bitter truth that even though he was a so-called member of the global community, when it came to a military confrontation between a European power and an African country, there was no way were they going to intercede on behalf of the African country. So the League basically ignored his appeals. He had a very famous last speech that he delivered before the League, but even that was ignored, even though it was widely covered, including by the New York Times, that speech by Selassie. So finally, Italy does invade with a massive invasion using mustard gas widely. This is the first major use of chemical weapons in a battle against an African country by a European country, and committed many, many massacres. It was really a genocidal war. And even then, the Ethiopians resisted and really never actually surrendered. They resisted even after the Italians took over the capital of Addis Ababa. The guerrilla insurgency continued throughout the years of Italian occupation. Then ultimately, of course, the tide turned in their favor when the Western Allied forces started pushing back the Italians and the Germans, and so was the case in Europe, and so was the case in Africa as well. And the Ethiopians reemerged, the emperor came back, and finally they were able to defeat the Italians. But I'm glad you raised this issue. That is one of the crimes that has not been adequately dealt with even today, because partly the story is not well known, is not widely told, is not sufficiently told. And as I was thinking about it earlier, I'm thinking at some point it would actually help to organize some seminars, now that we are using this Zoom platform to have a lot of constructive meetings and dialogues. That is something that certainly lends itself to such a major conversation, so
Yes,
that
excellent.
the people that have done the research can present it, so that the appropriate demands can actually be made even today in the 21st century.
I mean, indeed, I mean, we have a similar situation going on here in Germany about the crimes committed against the Herero and the Nama.
Yes.
And I mean, it's an ongoing controversy, and yeah, until today, Germany seems to be
Yes, but they're no longer ignoring it, because
they
now
can't anymore. Exactly.
there's been
Right.
many conversations about it. In fact,
Right.
remember at one time there was a lawsuit filed right here in federal court in the United States And I think that also generated a lot of publicity. And I think the Italian crimes in Ethiopia in 1936 also needs to be addressed the same way.
Right, right. Then in part 3 of your book, well, let me maybe ask another question that just came to my mind, because
Sure.
when you are explaining and showing also in your book how Western media seems to be like intricately like intertwined, let's say, with the colonial project. I wonder, how does this function? And I mean, part of your title is kind of a callback to manufacturing consent from Herman Chomsky, I guess, right?
Yes.
So how does one have to imagine this? Is it indeed the case that every last little journalist in there is himself a colonial apologist, or do those people actually believe in what they're writing there? And how does this happen? Like, do you have an idea or a concept on how does this streamlining of the whole narrative work so efficiently?
You know, that's a brilliant question. I'm glad you asked that question. Obviously, there are some that might or even must be apologists, and perhaps that's why they're hired in the first place. They're interviewed, after all, for these positions, right? Even dating back to since when. There's some who may have progressive inclinations, but at the end of the day, it is the editorial slant of the owners of that particular media outlet that will carry the day, regardless of what an individual journalist may feel or think. So I say this because it is only later that we can find out the true inclinations of some of the reporters. So, for example, a person like Chris Hedges, who is a very well-known public speaker now, a writer, a former journalist at the New York Times. One would not expect or just, presume that the New York Times would have a reporter like Chris Hedges.
Right.
But obviously, when he was working for the New York Times, he could only operate within certain confines as well. But even then, when I look back, I realized that he was one of the more favorite reporters that I used to follow at the New York Times, even before his politics was completely revealed, you see? So that's one example. But then on the other hand, when you see a reporter like Herbert Matthews, who covered the Italian conquest of Ethiopia in 1936, and he rode in the same vehicle as the conquering Italian army. And he was basically writing his articles read like a press release promoting the Italian conquest with melodramatic language. So you say, is this really a reporter, or is this part of the Italian invading army and their press secretary? But this was supposedly an independent reporter of the New York Times in 1936, Chris Matthews. Herbert Matthews, rather.
Herbert Matthews, yeah.
Now, this same reporter, later in his life, was condemned and accused of being a communist. Why was this? Because this same Matthews was the one who interviewed Fidel Castro when he was still hiding out in the Sierra and fighting against Batista. And Batista and other Western media outlets had reported that Castro had been killed, all his guerrilla fighters had been wiped out. And then Matthews makes his way into the mountains and has a sit-down, comprehensive interview with Castro, and is published in the New York Times, and gave him tremendous visibility and even gave him more support in Cuba itself and among Cuban exiles who now started sending more resources once they realized that Castro was actually not dead. This is the same Herbert Matthews, the same one whom I would view as an apologist, as an imperialist, when he wrote about Italy's conquest in 1936 of Ethiopia. It happens to be the same Matthews who later in his life now becomes an outcast as a pro-communist sympathizer because of his interview with Castro, right, which had a balanced tone, which was not dismissive of Castro, allowed him to give out his position, which was all published in the quotes in the New York Times. So that's why I think at the end of the day, the editorial slant of the publisher essentially is what carries the day. We saw that in the coverage of the uprising of Kenya, when the Kenyans started fighting for their land back from the British conquerors. And the coverage in the New York Times, of course, was very ugly, very racist, very demonizing the Kenyans, using that term that the British public relations experts came up with, called Mau Mau. Nobody even knows up to date what that word means. It's not a word that exists in Kenya, but it evoked that specter of monstrosity, right? And that's why it was very effective. Time magazine, another major US publication, also demonized the Kenyan fighters. They call themselves the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. So obviously they knew what they were fighting for. So I guess that's the best response I can give to that question. But there are clear cases where you can tell that they are apologists. The paper itself, I think we discussed in the first episode how a New York Times editorial in 1877 demonized Africans, said they were resembled more animals than human beings, and said that the best solution for this would be European civilization, and urged England to intervene and conquer and colonize before Germany could do it. That was an editorial in 1877. So sometimes it's very obvious that they are part of the colonial conquest agenda.
Right. Sometimes, exactly. That's also what I would say. Sometimes it's very explicit, even. I mean, right. we still have that today, right? So if you
absolutely, go to, without a doubt.
Yeah. I mean, if you go to the German Springer houses, the one like the Spiegel and Bild, like all these right-wing reactionary newspapers and magazines, they actually have, and this has been published, so we know that they actually have some kind of rules of conduct of how to write your articles and what you can say and what not. You can, for example, never, especially in regards to Israel and Palestine, for example, you can never use the word settler colonialism or apartheid, of course.
Right. They don't have to put it in writing, but you know that a publication like the New York Times has something similar to that as well.
Right. And then, I mean, that's what I wanted to say. Sometimes they have it very, very explicitly, like the confines, boom. But then at the same time, there's also something else going on, I think, which is, I mean, if you are bombarded by this kind of news and reporting and also depiction in the media, like movies, shows, etc., that also narrows your spectrum of imagination and what you as a journalist would go to, even who to talk to.
I agree with you totally, and that's why it's very critical whom we hire. Who are the people that we hire for the publication? And if you look at historically, a publication like the New York Times, the hires would be primarily young white males who are graduates of Harvard University. It's only in recent years that has begun to change. But then at the same time, when the popular narrative, the popular depiction on every issue is dictated from a capital-dominated, a capitalist-oriented slant, then the pool from where you draw the people you hire are going to be very narrow as well, you see? As as Richard Wolff, who also has a popular podcast, had pointed out years ago, that you could go to many U.S. universities and you will not find any department that's teaching socialist or Marxist economics, as if, neoliberalism was the only economics that exists in the world. And we're talking about academic institutions. So think about the general society then, So that is the predicament in which we operate. So sometimes the reporter himself or herself could be well-intentioned, but is not grounded on the information that they need to have an alternative imagination, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So they run to an African country, for example, they would veer toward the sources who they can identify with, right? And they would be capitalist oriented, Eurocentric, and preferably also educated in the West. And that is a major problem. So I'm glad you raised that issue as well.
Yep. And let's come to part 3. I want to spend some time also talking about the consequences for today, especially like regarding the Ukraine crisis, which has nothing to do, well, not immediately something to do with Africa, but we see some of the same mechanisms going on here, I would say. But in part 3, you talk a little bit about how this whole narrative and how media reporting and also media depiction evolved in the 20th century. And there are a couple of stereotypes that you address that I find really interesting. And this is actually something that I have also noticed. One is the idea of the noble African versus the true Negro or the true African, right? Like if I think of a movie, it is Hotel Rwanda, I think. That was the first time that I realized that there is this this dichotomy of, we have this very, very noble, lovely guy with his family, and then we have all these, like, and they are the majority, all these savages that want to kill each other, right? So, how, like, can you elaborate a little bit on this narrative and how this functions, and where can we find it and observe it, really?
Okay, very good. Well, actually, I discuss it in several parts of my book, that this has always been the inclination in terms of depicting Africans. If we go back even centuries earlier to the writings of Afra Ben, who was reputedly the first English woman to make a living by her writing. And she wrote The Royal's Slave. That was her book. And in her writing, she is describing an African character who is leading an uprising against enslavement. So she's describing a hero. And then in describing her hero, she is then giving out the attributes of this hero. So I want to just quickly read maybe just a minute from part of this book, which was written in the 17th century. And for people that are not familiar, her last name is spelled Ben, B-E-H-N. The first name is Afra, A-P-H-R-A. Quote, this is from The Royal Slave. I'm quoting now. His face was not of that brown rusty black, which most of that nation are, but a perfect ebony or polished jet. His nose was rising and Roman instead of African and flat. His mouth, the finest shaped that could be seen, far from those great turned lips, which are so natural to the rest of the Negroes. Ben noted that, quote, bating his color, there could be nothing in nature more beautiful, agreeable, and handsome. There was no one grace wanting that bears the standard of true beauty. His hair came down to his shoulders by the aid of art, which was for pulling it out with a quill and keeping it combed, of which he took particular care. So this is in the 17th century, right? Describing the ideal African. And this was an ally of African people, because she's actually writing about this hero who leads a successful rebellion against slavery. But her vision of the ideal African is just as I just read right now. She's describing it. Now, we go centuries later when we see the conflict in Rwanda. And you asked me that question about the characterization of the noble savage. The noble savage were how the Tutsis were projected in Rwanda, while the Hutus were demonized and said to have much more explicit African features, just as Afroben described in her book of the 17th century. So I'm trying to see if I can find a scene where this writer named Alex Shumatov, writing an article in the Sunday magazine of the New York Times, is describing the Tutsi and contrasting them with the Hutus. This is early in this conflict, because as you know, the primarily Tutsi army had invaded Rwanda from neighboring Uganda, supported by the Ugandan military, of course, under dictator Yoweri Museveni, because many of the descendants of Tutsis who had fled earlier massacres in the 1960s in Rwanda and fled to Uganda and grew up there, many of them ended up fighting alongside Museveni when he was fighting his insurgency. So they helped him seize power in Uganda. So as payback, he supported an invasion of Rwanda. And Alex Shumatov, who is supposed to be a so-called journalist, actually throughout the conflict was acting as a public relations agent for the invading army, which was called the Rwanda Patriotic Front. And the New York Times, to its shame, allowed him space to publish his propaganda. So let's find where he's contrasting the Tutsis versus the Hutus in his writing. Okay. In the late 19th century, end quote, Shumatov continued describing Tutsis, quote, early ethnologists were fascinated by these languidly haughty pastoral aristocrats whose high foreheads, aquiline noses, and thin lips seemed more Caucasian than Negroid, and they classed them as false Negroes. In a popular theory of the day, the Tutsis were thought to be highly civilized people, the race of fallen Europeans whose existence in Central Africa had been rumored for centuries, end quote, Shumatov wrote, and added, quote, they are not a race or a tribe, as often described, but a population, a stratum, a mystical warrior priest elite, like the Druids in Celtic society. The Hutus, far from resembling any warrior priest, in Shumatov's estimation, they were, he wrote, this is a quote now from him writing, short, stocky, local Bantu agriculturalist. And then he goes on in another setting later on to describe their thick lips and their broad nose as well. And this is an article being written in on December 13, 1992. not very different from the book that Afro Ben wrote in the 17th century, you see? And obviously, this had a political agenda behind it. The purpose was to dehumanize the Hutu, who were the majority population in both Rwanda and Burundi. They make up 85% of the population, and to humanize and celebrate the Tutsi. Meaning, as early as 1992, it was known by some people, including Shumatov, that the Tutsis would end up in power in Rwanda, even though that did not happen until 1994. So what was the purpose of these types of depictions? Glorifying on the one hand and demonizing. My argument is that to make it acceptable that a population, a part of a population that makes up less than 15% of the country's population would end up governing the majority. So the mindset was being conditioned. Now, was there a plan to eventually shoot down the plane carrying the Hutu president of Rwanda? Well, that has been suggested. And in fact, there's a documentary that deals with it in depth. It's called Rwanda's Untold Story. The documentary was produced by the BBC. And in that documentary, some of the most senior advisors to Paul Kagame, who was the leader of the Rwanda Patriotic Front and is today the president of Rwanda, the person who later on became his chief of staff in his office, civilian, and the person who became his chief of staff in his army, both have now said that he actually gave the order to shoot down the presidential plane. Now, why would he want to do something like that? Because the Rwanda Patriotic Front and the government of Rwanda had just concluded a peace agreement negotiated in Tanzania. They had been pressured by many African countries to end this conflict that had raged from 1990 to 1994. And part of the peace agreement was to hold elections in several months down the line. And had elections been held, it was obvious that the majority Hutu population would vote for the government so that the Rwanda Patriotic Front would essentially be shut out of power. And as the narrative goes, by shooting down the presidential plane, it was almost predictable what would happen. You would have the kind of mass uncontrolled killings that indeed erupted. And then Kagame, whose army, of course, was supported by the regular Ugandan army, would be able to seize power and say that it is restoring law and order. And nobody would raise the issue that, wait, how are you going to govern a majority Hutu population? And that is exactly what unfolded in Rwanda. So that's why I do not dismiss that demonization that occurred in the New York Times Magazine, and the New Yorker also published similar articles by this same writer, Alex Shumatov. And then, listen to this. Alex Shumatov, in the same article, reveals that he is married to a woman who is the cousin or some relative of the press spokesperson for the Rwanda Patriotic Front. And yet the New York Times still went ahead and publishes that article. And that goes back to your question earlier on. When and how do these seemingly independent media outlets sometimes actually take an active role in fulfilling a military or political agenda?
Yeah, I think it's not very believable that they didn't do a background check on this guy to find out what his connections are. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Very, very good. I want to come to one more topic because I think it has some kind of relevance in Germany. And that has to do with your rejection of the term tribe. You're talking about this in the book too.
Right.
We have something similar in Germany, actually. At least I would think that it's similar. People with Arab backgrounds are by the media, there is a certain group of people with Arab backgrounds that are stamped
Right.
as being, clans. It's not, they're not being called tribes, but they're being called clans. And clan as tribe has some kind of scientific allure to it, as if it's like an anthropological category. But at the same time, in media, it is always exclusively connected with a negative depiction and always connected to somehow, either violence or criminality, drug business here in terms of the clan criminality in Germany. And you have similar rejections towards this term. Can you explain this a little bit? Why?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, that went hand in hand with colonial conquest in Africa, when the Africans were constantly referred to as tribes or tribesmen or tribal, and there was no difference between using those terms. They were interchangeable with natives and savages, you see, during the conquest. And then during the colonial era itself, if you refer to tribal peoples, tribal communities, tribal land, tribal law, it's a clear indication that the people themselves, the customs, the traditions are certainly not on par on anything that is European or anything that is civilized. So it was used with an objective purpose. So for example, when the Kenyans were fighting to recover their land, every article that I analyzed referred to the Kenyans as tribesmen. Many of the articles, it was formulaic, whether it was in the New York Times, whether it was in Time magazine. Time magazine had a publisher, Henry Lucy was the publisher. He had supported Chiang Kai-shek in the struggle. And of course, Mao prevailed. So he turned his attention to Africa, where he was continuing the same crusade, this time on behalf of British imperialism. So it was very important to depict the Kenyans as who were fighting as godless, unchristian, superstitious, steeped in witchcraft, influenced, quote unquote, by communists, and certainly tribal. So the T word was perhaps one of the most effective in terms of demonizing Africans during the conquest, during the colonial regime, and in the era that followed the colonial regime. So for example, in the struggle for the Congo, the supporters of Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected prime minister of the Congo, were depicted as tribal, while the supporters of Moïse Tshombe, who was the puppet of the multinational corporations as well as Belgium, they used him as a stooge, of course, for the excuse to intervene militarily in the Congo by encouraging him to break away from the rest of the country and declare Katanga region, which not coincidentally was the copper-rich region, declared independent so that he could invite the Belgians to come back, which is exactly what happened. And Tshombe was depicted as a detribalized African, meaning an African who accepts working under the control and influence of the multinational corporations of the West, Europeanized and civilized. So that is how effective the use of the term tribe, tribal, and tribesmen has been used in Africa. And of course, in my book, I discuss how a reporter of the New York Times in the 1960s, how during the course of my research, I found letters that he wrote complaining to his editors here in New York, writing from Africa, that why did they constantly use the term tribal and tribesmen in his articles? They would insert it even when he did not write it. And in one instance, which is a gem actually, and sometimes when you do research, you come across gems.
Yes.
This I consider a gem. He wrote complaining after editors sitting here in New York had manufactured a scene about Nigerians dressed in grass leaves, which he did not see, the reporter did not see, the reporter did not write in his articles, but editors sitting here in New York manufactured it and inserted it into his article.
Right, right.
Because
That
to
was
them,
unbelievable.
it did not meet the condition of a story that could be occurring in Africa. It was not tribal enough, you see?
Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy. If you really try to imagine that there are people sitting there and they're like saying, this does not seem.
Oh, no, this is not enough.
This is not enough. No. We need some people in leaves.
No, this does not ring true.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Let's. I have you for like 8 more minutes, so I wanna ask my last question and maybe make it a bit more open.
And it's fine. There will even be a part 3. These conversations never end.
We should continue for sure. Yes, please. In your book, you do one thing that is very interesting, I think, to the current moment. You talk extensively about how the NATO war on Libya showed also how Western media are still, until today, reproducing the same kind of stereotypes, narratives, racist tropes as
Right.
kind of like 200 years ago. And the reason why I draw a little bit of a connection is because we are we are approaching a similar situation. Of course, NATO hasn't, in this case, started this explicit war right now, but we do realize that something is happening in our media, at least here in Germany. I'm sure also in the US, and there's a huge shift. So I think it makes a lot of sense to become aware of this in order to develop some kind of intellectual self-defense. So can you tell us what you observed in the case of Libya at that time, and what could we, especially as leftists, learn from that on if we want to do some reporting in the future, if we want to talk to people about this, what is it that we should take care of?
Okay, well,
2 questions.
The Libya narrative, which we're seeing right now in the conflict in Ukraine, the corporate media, there has to be Indians and cowboys. There has to be a Tarzan and the savages. There has to be an angel and the devil. So in Libya, Gaddafi was the devil, and the NATO insurgents were the angels. So when the angels are behaving like devils, you cannot tell that story because people would become confused. People would say, well, who are the good guys then? Because you've conditioned the people that consume, bad corporate media is like junk food, Somebody who's been used to junk food would not appreciate the value of organic food, you see? And that's how I characterize it. So in Libya, when the NATO supported insurgents, the New York Times, by the way, in many articles refer to them as freedom fighters. When they started cutting off the heads of Libyans that looked like me and posting it on social media, that became a problem. So what did the corporate media do, including the New York Times? Just ignore the story. Ignore the story. So this behavior continued. And then finally, the insurgents got to the city of Tawaga, which was populated by almost exclusively by Libyans that looked like me. Population about 50,000, and destroyed that city, killed people, many fled, They ethnically cleansed that city of Tawaga, and they wrote on the buildings words like slaves on the buildings that they burned down. Not mentioned in the New York Times, not mentioned on CNN, not mentioned on BBC, Washington Post, because people would start asking questions. Wait a minute, these are supposed to be the good guys? These are the guys that we are using US taxpayer dollars and NATO, other European taxpayer dollars to install in power? It would be problematic, especially for the United States, which at that time had a Black president, Barack Obama, right? It would be politically very difficult for him, particularly if the elected Black politicians started mobilizing the society, said, wait a minute, we can't support this. This is ethnically targeted cleansing of Black people in Libya with our tax dollars. So what happened? They ignored the story. To its credit, the Wall Street Journal wrote about it. We, of course, wrote many editorials, and we paid a political price for that. That's how you realize how the establishment works. So when they talk about this freedom of information, freedom of media, it's all nonsense when politics trumps at the end of the day. Because one editorial we wrote, the strongest one out of the many editorials, we told our readers, call the New York Times publisher, we gave the phone number. Call the State Department, we gave the phone number. Call the White House, gave the phone number. Call the National Urban League, which is an organization that supports Black causes and issues. We gave the phone number. Call the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, a well-known, renowned national organization, gave the phone number and asked them, why are you not making a cry for the Black Libyans that are being ethnically cleansed in Libya? Lo and behold, the day after we posted that editorial, we could not access our website for 3 days. Our hosting company, Network Solutions, would tell us that there's a technical issue we are dealing with. On the third day, I called at about 4 a.m. I spoke with people. I said, I need to take your name. I spoke with 3 different people. I got their names and titles. I went back to bed. When I got up, our website, blackstarnews.com, was back up, except that editorial had been deleted. Let's think about it.
No way.
It's in my book. I discuss it. It's in my book.
I know.
Private company, private company, Network Solution is not some tiny company. It's a major company. And it can only be a government entity, of course, can intervene and have them first hijack website. We're not a major publication. We don't have the resources. You know, this is something I founded, you know, with some seed money from people that had money, right? And then after releasing our website back to our control, after deleting that particular article, and the article had already been published by many other websites, thankfully. So what we did is we wrote an editorial saying, this is the editorial some people don't want you to read. We published this new editorial, and we linked our new editorial to other websites that had run our editorial. Imagine, this story would not have been known. The New York Times finally did some stories well after the fact when it could no longer change the tide. Gaddafi had already, I think, been removed from Tripoli by that time. That is
publicly massacred and sodomized, and
absolutely
that was all around,
by the so-called freedom fighters, who now have turned Libya into a plantation where they have open auctions of Africans. You know, taking us back to the 17th century. So I say this, and in fact, I'm glad you posed this last question, because yesterday I told my students, after we discussed many examples where the media completely one-sided narrative to the exclusion of a big story like the one I just discussed right now. But we were not dealing with a specific example, but we were dealing with another example in class. And then I asked the class, what conflict is ongoing where we are also getting a very simplistic narrative of angel versus devils.
Mm-hmm.
That you think, even though you don't know what you're missing, you think you must be missing a lot of critical information. And several hands went up, and all of them said Ukraine. And that is what we are dealing with today. So, for example, now you're seeing more editorials, because when you have all these talking heads, US officials, when you have the talking heads, they bring on shows like MSNBC, on CNN, they keep talking about totally unprovoked war. That's very misleading, you know?
Yes.
And you can critique it and criticize the invasion and still call it a war of aggression.
Of course.
But you can still analyze the issues that led up to it.
Yes.
And they're not minor issues, you see?
Yes.
So it's completely disingenuous to keep talking about totally unprovoked war, totally unprovoked. And that's what the common person on the street is now saying. So you have and many volunteers now wanting to leave the US to go and fight for Ukraine. You have, yesterday I saw a volunteer, I don't know how he's going to get there, an African American who wants to go and fight in Ukraine. And I'm telling myself, has he not been watching the difficulties faced by Africans who are trying to get out of the country, being
getting out
and some being told that we're going to let you fight instead of getting out of the country? And you know, so sometimes you realize in instances like this how big of an enemy the corporate media really are.
Right. Here. And yeah, I mean, that's also then the second question of what can we do in order to create a counterbalance to that and also not fall for the same tropes. That's
well, thankfully for social media, because otherwise we would not even be having this conversation years ago.
Yeah, indeed.
You know, thank you for social media. I would never have been able to publish those editorials.
Right.
And expose that indeed you're being watched, you're being monitored, and they can decide when to intervene. I had suspected these things, but now I know for a fact how this country operates. So now when I tell my friends sometimes, and they don't believe it, it doesn't matter, you know?
Yes.
In that particular case, I actually got a lawyer, and the lawyer was interested to take the case, but he said, I must tell you two things. Number one, it will be difficult for you to show damages, right? Since the website has been restored to you, right?
Right.
Number one. Number two, we are operating in a very hostile political environment right now. Everybody is pro-regime change. You know, when you have the New York Times publish editorials criticizing NATO for not bombing enough.
Yeah,
because if they bomb more, it would weaken Gaddafi's army faster and hasten the end of the war. This was not coming from the New York Post or some right-wing publication. This was an editorial on the so-called liberal New York Times.
Right.
So we need to have more platforms like this on social media. We need to also find a way to bring all our talents collectively. Is there a site where we can all collaborate and challenge the narratives of the corporate media and get a way to build up that critical mass of traffic as well? Because we certainly need that as well.
We've been talking about that for a long time now, and the need to have some kind of network and maybe some, you know, even maybe some good old TV broadcasting and stuff like that, and radios, and because we are in the internet, we are still talking to quite a narrow niche of people, right?
Absolutely.
But and then there's the other question is, when we actually reach that critical mass, will it then continue to be so easy for us to use social media, or will we run into the same stories that you had back then, right? But okay, that's another question for another day.
Yes, absolutely.
Milton, thank you so much. It was great having you again, and we will definitely repeat this. I will get back to you, and we'll have you back on in a couple of months.
I look forward to another conversation. Be well.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice evening, and thanks for everybody in the chat. Thanks for joining. Have a nice
Somebody
evening.
said they very depressing listening to all of that, and I think it's better to be informed than not to be informed, though. So that's what I would tell to that person.
Truth hurts, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes
All
like
right,
that.
thank you.
Bye, Milton. Bye.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.